The argument from authority. The argument from authority is our third and final inductive argument we'll look at. Like all inductive arguments, it is such that the premises are offered as supporting the conclusion with probability. So if it's doing what it's supposed to, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion is at best probably true. Now, as you might guess from the title, it's an argument in which the conclusion is supported by citing an authority or expert. And the strength of an argument of this particular type of argument, depends on the quality of the authority. Now, even a really good argument from authority is a relatively weak form of argument. Why? Well, again, the idea is essentially when you use one, you're saying this person's an expert, they make this claim, so it's true. So it's a very indirect support for the claim, as opposed to directly supporting the conclusion. And so it is relatively weak. So then, if it's relatively weak, why do we use it? Well, there are three main reasons. First, we use them because we don't know everything. Because there's so much to know, no one person can be an expert, even at a small fraction of their field. And so everyone, even experts, have to turn to other experts. So, for example, unless you're a medical doctor or a medical professional, you go to medical professionals. And if you believe what they say, you're using an argument from authority. Similarly, when we rely on the views of like engineers, mechanics, plumbers, electricians, etc., and accept their claim because of their expertise, we're using an argument from authority. Second reason is they're often used to add extra weight to a person's position. So a person argues for something and then says the other experts or experts agree with me. That lends more support. Thirdly, people often use arguments from authority as part of other arguments. For example, suppose you're doing a paper, an ethics course on capital punishment. Unless you're an expert on the statistics and psychology of capital punishment, you would need to go to actual experts to get information about the deterrence value of capital punishment, if you're using that in your paper. And so you might make an argument from authority, citing these experts and their studies and research, and essentially saying this claim about the deterrence value or lack thereof of capital punishment is supported by the authority of these experts. And so those are some reasons to use the argument from authority, even though it's relatively weak. And again, the practical reason why we use it is because in many cases it's the only option. We have to go by the experts. So we've looked at the informal version. Again, this expert makes a claim, therefore it's true. But what's the formal form? Well, it's an argument with two premises and, of course, only one conclusion. So, formally put, premise 1. Person A is an authority on subject S. Premise 2. Person A makes claim C about subject S. Conclusion, therefore C is true. So how do we know when an argument from authority is good or bad? Well, for example, suppose we take a case of like medical information, a claim about medicine or a claim about diet. How would we assess, say, a claim about nutrition? Well, the standards for this argument are relatively straightforward, and there's quite a few of them, but here are the standards briefly considered. First, and probably the most important, is the person has sufficient expertise in the subject. To the degree this is true, the argument is strong. Now, expertise could include formal education, having, say, a doctorate in it. As an example, I've got a PhD in philosophy, therefore you can believe what I'm saying about the argument from authority. And yes, that's an argument from authority supporting my claim about an argument from authority. Now, it can also be informal, uncredentialed, undocumented expertise. A person could be really good at something they never went to school for. And there are obviously people that are good at that kind of stuff. And there are some things they don't have school for, that you can't get a PhD or a master's degree or certification in. And so the first question is, does this person have adequate expertise? To the degree the answer is yes, the argument is stronger. Second, even if the person is an expert, if they have a doctorate in a field, there's also the very important claim, very important concern about whether the claim is in their actual area of expertise. Because a person could be a world-renowned expert, say in software design, or famous for being incredibly successful in business, like Elon Musk, for example, or Bill Gates. But in great expertise and success in one area doesn't automatically make a person an expert in another field. So again, taking the example of, say, Bill Gates. He got Microsoft going, he's a billionaire, really smart guy. But his claims outside of his lane, outside of his field of expertise, have no special, credibility. Doesn't mean he's wrong. But if Bill Gates started talking about, say, philosophy, or he started talking about political issues or medicine, he doesn't have special expertise in those areas and should not be considered an authority. Now, again, this does not mean that he's wrong. Simply because a person is not a credentialed expert in a field doesn't mean their claims are therefore false. But if a person is speaking outside their field, the argument of authority would be fairly weak. So if you accepted, say, medical advice from Bill Gates, then he's not a medical doctor, and hence it's not that you should reject the claim, because he may be right. It's that you would not have grounds to believe it based on his expertise in medicine, because he doesn't have that. As another example, think of how actors and other celebrities, like athletes, endorse products and get a lot of attention when they make political claims and other claims. They get in the news saying this. They get more attention than actual experts. Now, a person may be an amazing actor. They may be, great at basketball or football or tennis. But unless they have expertise in the relevant field, what they say about politics or economics has no authority to it. Again, it doesn't mean they're wrong. You can't logically and rationally infer that, well, this person is just a famous tennis player, so their claim is false. That doesn't follow. But a person's celebrityness in one field does not automatically confer expertise in another. But commercials and rhetoric rely heavily on this, and it's often used in politics and advertising to sway people, which creates what's called a fallacious argument from authority. It's bad logic. A third very critical factor is the adequate agreement among the experts. Now, how much agreement is required? Well, there's no exact standard, but it needs to be a majority opinion. Kind of the gold standard of an argument by authority, perhaps even like platinum or diamond, is that it corresponds with or matches the agreement of the majority of qualified experts. So why is this important? Well, even though the lone rebel, going against everyone else could be right, it is far more likely that the majority of qualified experts will be correct. Now, it's not guaranteed, and people can always point to examples where the majority of experts were wrong, the rebel was right. But the vast majority of cases, which are not particularly interesting because it's not very exciting to say, why, yes, the vast majority of experts in the field were right. You don't see films like that. And then all the experts working together for years and years reached a consensus and found that this was true. That's pretty boring. It's the rebel going against everybody that's exciting. But from the standpoint of critical thinking, the majority opinion of qualified experts is probably true, but it's inductive reasoning, so of course it could be false. So for example, when it comes to medical information, the majority opinion of qualified experts on things like viruses and pandemics and so forth, they're the ones to go with. Are they guaranteed to be right? No. But it's more likely that the vast number of qualified experts will get it right than non-experts, certainly, and the rebel expert who goes against them. And so you need to look at the agreement among experts. Now, as a final point here, people do tend to, of course, go with the expert they like. So if there's, vast consensus on an issue, but there's one or two or few experts who go against it, people often go with those rebels if they like that view and don't like the other view. But a fair question to ask is, how do they know that these rebels are right, given the consensus of the other experts? If they themselves are not an expert, why pick the few? And the answer is usually purely psychological. They like that view. So, for example, if someone is opposed to the notion that climate change is real, the vast majority of qualified experts claim that it is. So from an argument, from authority standpoint, that's the rational thing to believe. Could it be false? Sure. But the likelihood that the lone rebel is right is very low. And someone who's not an expert who says, this lone rebel is right, a fair question to ask them is, well, what's the basis of that? Why do they prefer that one rebel over all the others? And the answer is probably, since the person is not an expert, is probably that's just how they feel. It's purely psychological rather than logical. So third standard, agreement among experts. Now, what if there is not agreement among experts? Well, in that case, the rational thing to do is probably suspend judgment, because if the experts cannot agree, and I am not an expert, how am I supposed to know? So the rational thing to do is, which is always an option, is to say, I don't know. That's a fair point. Fourth standard is a matter of bias and prejudice. An expert must not be significantly biased. Now, this doesn't mean the person must be perfectly objective and lacking all biases at all, because then we'd have no experts, because everybody's, a person, and we all come with our biases and influences. Now, to the degree that an expert is biased, it weakens the argument. So, for example, if the expert has a definite political agenda they're trying to push, weakens their argument. If the expert is being, paid and supported by, say, a source or company or person that has a definite agenda, that weakens, the argument. To give a concrete example, back when, they were looking at the question of does smoking cause cancer or not, there were many experts who were being paid by the tobacco companies to say, that it's fine, it doesn't cause cancer. And of course, they're being paid. And so, as they often say, follow the money. So if someone is being paid by, say, a company that builds solar panels, and they're always talking about how great green energy is, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but if they're being paid by a company that has a reason for this to be accepted, that provides grounds for suspicion. Again, bias doesn't mean that someone is wrong. To fall for that would be to fall for what's called an ad hominem attack, a type of fallacy. But bias is a legitimate point of concern. Next, the area of expertise has got to be a legitimate one. It can't be just some, roughly put, BS. Now, there can be considerable and very emotional and violent debate about what is legitimate or not. So, for example, there are people who believe in, say, the power of healing crystals. My own view is that, based on the majority opinion of qualified experts, there is nothing to that. There is no there. Or another example, there are those who claim that certain metals have healing powers. Like if you put on a copper bracelet, it will help you with arthritis. And again, there doesn't seem to be any scientific backing for that at all. And so someone who claimed to be an expert at crystal healing or metal healing, it would not seem to be a legitimate area. And so their claims would not gain credibility from an argument from authority. Again, it doesn't mean they're therefore wrong. It just means that you would have no good reason to then accept their claim as true. And again, this can be a matter of contentious battle, because there are those who really believe in, say, the healing power of crystals and various other things. And so there can be some serious fights here. Lastly, the authority must be properly cited. You've got to be able to identify it. Otherwise, it's an anonymous authority. So why would that matter? Well, when you make an argument from authority, the strength of the argument depends on the qualities of the expert. And if you don't know the qualities of the expert, the argument's going to be pretty weak. Now, this is often a problem in reporting today, because they often have to use anonymous sources for various, in some cases, good reasons, like protecting sources from retaliation, reprisal, violence. And so they'll cite sources, using them as an expert, to support their claims, but they remain anonymous or vaguely identified, like sources close to the president or someone with knowledge of the event. So what you're doing in that case is kind of a double argument from authority. If you believe, say, a reporter who's citing an unnamed expert, you're trusting that the reporter is expert enough to assess the expertise of the source, and that the source is an expert. So it's double induction, making it relatively weak. So whenever possible, it's important to cite the authority. And if you've written a paper, where you're citing sources to support your statements, you've done this. It's often done in footnotes and endnotes. So that is the argument from authority, which concludes the last of our 3 arguments that are inductive. And of course, there are many, many more inductive arguments, but this course is an introduction to philosophy. And if you want to see more inductive arguments, consider the critical inquiry class and the logic class. And next, we'll move on to looking at the origin of Western philosophy.